I am planning on doing a favorites list, but so far it mostly consists of Nikolai Gogol, so I think I need to read more of Russian literature in order to make it a little bit more diverse. But today I'm gonna look at a different list, a Goodreads top 20 of the Russian literature, because I've read most of them and I have thoughts. I'm not overly familiar with how Goodreads works these days. It's blocked in Russia as well. I think there are lists where people vote on their favorites, but I wanted to look at a different kind of perspective, and that's the top 20 based on average user rating. The cutoff that I've chosen is that the book needs to have at least 50,000 user ratings. I'm going to give you the elevator pitch for these books and also provide my thoughts if I have any. Let's get into it. Number 20, Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov, 3.88, 800,000+ user ratings. I've recently made myself suffer for this book for this channel. If I hadn't been planning on reviewing it online, I would have quit pretty early on. I feel like everyone is at least familiar with the basic plot because of its controversial nature, even if it's slightly distorted in the public eye. The novel tells a story of a man, Humbert, who takes advantage of a 12-year-old girl and then mentally, physically, and sexually abuses her. Just like most things written by Nabokov, you shouldn't take everything that is on the page at face value. In Lolita specifically, he uses the unreliable narrator device to make the reader question everything that he's written. Personally, I don't like Nabokov very much. He comes off as incredibly sanctimonious and arrogant, and his writing is the same way. His prose is packed to the brim with epithets, comparisons, and other literary devices, and it's becomes so overwhelming that the narrative gets completely lost. And one might argue that's the entire point, as the narrative can be rather thin, but his beautiful prose should make up for it, but in my opinion it does not. With Lolita specifically, the subject matter is so repulsive that no amount of bon mot is going to make me forget about it. If you decide to read it, I would suggest that you focus on the unreliable narrator element of it, and how Humbert and the author are playing with the reader and their perspective of the events. But if you honestly ask me, check something else out by Nabokov, and we should probably let Lolita be. And also an argument can be made that Lolita is not actually a Russian novel. While Nabokov is of Russian origin and has written many things in Russian, Lolita specifically was written originally in English and then translated into Russian by Nabokov, rather poorly at that. But the plot, the setting, and the subject matter make it more of an American novel than it ever could be Russian. Fun fact about the novel, when Stanley Kubrick set off to adapt Lolita for cinema, Nabokov himself wrote the screenplay, but it ended up being far too long as he believed everything to be incredibly important and it couldn't be cut. So adaptation didn't use Nabokov's screenplay, and thus it strayed far from the original. Nabokov's screenplay is now available, you can check it out because it has some interesting changes from the novel. Number 19, We by Evgeniy Zamyatin, 3.89, 95,000 user ratings. We is the first dystopia written by Evgeniy Zamyatin in the 1920s Soviet Union. It then inspired all of the famous dystopias of the 20th century, such as 1984 by George Orwell or Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. We tells the story of a man, D503, who lives in a distant future, where everything about his life is regulated. They all live in the same houses, wear the same clothing, go to work at the same time, there's total surveillance, etc. D503 is actually quite happy with his life until one day he meets a woman who turns his entire world upside down and even manages to persuade him to become a revolutionary, maybe. If you read We now, you will see all of these tropes that we've come to associate with the genre: total surveillance, totalitarian state, tortures and executions, control of the interpersonal relationships, etc. But because this was the first dystopia, all of these elements are rather basic. The world building is somewhat weaker than the dystopias that followed, but We still interrogates the same questions of personal choice, identity, community, etc. Fun fact, Zamyatin actually predicted quite a few things from the 20th century, such as total surveillance, artificial food, glass houses, and numbers used instead of names. Number 18, The Gambler by Fyodor Dostoevsky, 3.91, 86,000 user ratings. And And here we are at the book I have not read, nor will I, and the reason is simple. I completely despise Dostoevsky and all of his writing. This actually makes this video rather hard to make because about the third of this list is Dostoevsky. But let's power through, and I will try to be as impartial as I can be. The Gambler is loosely based on Dostoevsky's own experience. For years he suffered from a severe gambling addiction, specifically roulette. He'd lose every bit of money he had to it. And The Gambler tells the story of addiction. Almost every character falls to it at one point or another, and it destroys them. The protagonist, Alexei Ivanovich, also falls victim to a different passion, and that of a woman. And the fictional Polina seems to be based on Apollinaria Suslova, a woman that Dostoevsky loved passionately. He'd gone with her to Europe for the first time, where he fell victim to the casinos, and this relationship was rather torturous for the both of them. I'm not going to give you a recommendation as to whether or not you should read it, because I haven't read it myself, but based on the research that I've done, it seems like it's one of the lighter books from Dostoevsky, so it might be an interesting one to start with if you haven't read Dostoevsky yet. A fun fact about the novel: this novel was written as part of the bet with the publisher Stilovsky. Dostoevsky was supposed to write him a novel in a year, and if he failed to do that, Stilovsky would get rights to publish all of Dostoevsky's work from this point on for incredibly cheap. Dostoevsky procrastinated this task until there was only 1 month left. Friends then suggested that he should hire a secretary and assistant to help him type out, so he would dictate to her, and that should help with the speed of writing. He hired a young woman, Anna Snitkina, to whom he confessed the dire situation that he found himself in. She was a big fan of his already, and she kind of reassured him that they would manage. And within a month, they've written The Gambler. The publisher, though, was not a particularly nice fellow. He actually skipped town on the day that Dostoevsky was supposed to turn the novel in, so that he couldn't fulfill his part of the bet. But Dostoevsky acted smartly for once, and he'd left the novel at the police station, kind of with a record that he tried to find Stilovsky, but he couldn't, and he fulfilled his part of the bet. And as far as Anna goes, well, Dostoevsky proposed to her soon after, and she became his second wife and the mother of his children. Number 17, Dead Souls by Nikolai Gogol, 3.98 with 83,000 user ratings. And all too soon we've come to my current favorite book, and that is Dead Souls by Nikolai Gogol. I don't blame you though. Gogol is notoriously difficult to translate, and in order to fully appreciate his work you need to have a good translation. I recommend this one. The novel tells the story of a man, Pavel Chichikov, who, in order to improve his financial state, decided on a caper to buy dead souls. Over the course of the story, he meets various landowners, and in a satirical and humorous way, Gogol describes this adventure. Gogol's stories, they are like ogres, they have layers. This was the main piece of work that Gogol envisioned for himself, his magnum opus, so it allows for multitudes of interpretations and analysis. You can read it simply as a satirical novel. Gogol has fun with his writing, he's incredibly funny, so it can be just that. You can dig deeper. The most popular interpretation of the novel uses the connection to Dante's Inferno, so you can look for metaphorical meanings. I also recommend reading it while paying attention to the language that he uses, how he plays with it, what words, epithets he uses. He's truly magnificent that way. Fun fact about the novel, Dead Souls was originally planned as part of the trilogy. The second volume was already written, but Gogol burned it just a few days before his death. Number 16, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Alexander Solzhenitsin, 3.98 with 111,000 user ratings. One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, as advertised, portrays one day in the life of Ivan, and Ivan is a prisoner of a hard labor camp somewhere in Siberia. During his day, he describes the inhuman conditions that the prisoners are kept in, meager food that they're given, and the work that they're supposed to do at the building SHP outside in the minus 30 degrees Celsius temperatures. and constant surveillance and the threat of solitary confinement, which is, in these conditions, basically a death sentence. He describes the politics that exist within the camp and various things that the prisoner could do, tricks that he can employ to get himself slightly better conditions, like an extra portion of soup. The book is based on Alexander Solzhenitsyn's own experience. He spent 8 years in various prisons and political camps in Siberia. The events of the book, just as Solzhenitsyn's own experience, fall on the period of Stalin's harshest repressions in USSR. The book was originally written in 1959, but was obviously not published in USSR. But the thing about Solzhenitsyn and his work is that it's inseparable from the anti-Soviet movement in the USSR and abroad. The Gulag Archipelago and Solzhenitsyn are at the very core of the dissident movement, so this is more than a book. One Day in a Life was the first book that he's written on the subject, so it started this wave. So it transcends beyond what is on the page and becomes a part of a bigger whole. This is not a book to have a fun fact about it, but I remember reading it in high school and it made quite an impression. It was a different time too, beyond my being younger and more naive. It was the 2000s in Russia, the freest time we had here. So such inhumanities, they seemed almost impossible. And the more depressing it was to reread it now and not to feel the same punch, as this is not a story anymore, once again. Number 15, Fathers and Sons by Ivan Turgenev, 3.99 with 87,000 user ratings. Turgenev's most famous work tells the story of Evgeniy Bazarov, who, along with his friend, comes to that friend's country estate and quickly comes into the conflict with the fathers there, his friend's father and uncle. Bazarov, a nihilist, then comes up against the test of love as he falls in love with a widow Odintsova, and that puts all of his beliefs to the test. While the generational conflict, as advertised in the title, is at center stage, what really solidified Fathers and Sons as a Russian classic was the character of Bazarov. This character type is somewhat unique. He's a composite of various people that Turgenev saw in Russia in the late 1950s, the new wave of the nihilist movement, and thus Bazarov also became the symbol of that movement. And yes, Turgenev criticizes these new ideas that were brewing in the minds of the younger generation at that time, but he's also critical of the older generation. Some ideas in the novel are the product of their time, but some are universal, which makes this book somewhat timeless. I am personally a little bit conflicted on the novel. There are parts of it that I absolutely love, like the language and the composition, and then there are things that I absolutely despise, and that's mostly the character of Bazarov. So I encourage you to read it yourself and make your own judgments on it. Fun fact about the novel used to have an epigraph that kind of summarizes the basic conflict, and the epigraph was later removed as it simplified the book quite a bit. Young man to a middle-aged man, you had the substance without the force. Middle-aged man, and you had a force without sustenance. Number 14, Dr. Zhivago by Boris Pasternak, 4.01 with 95,000 user ratings. Dr. Zhivago is an interesting beast. The book tells the story of Yuri Zhivago as he, along with his family and extended community, go through the early 20th century in Russia, starting in the Tsar Russia, going through World War I, Civil War, and into the newly established Soviet Union. One might call it a historical novel on par with something like War and Peace, but Tolstoy is just as interested in describing the historical events as he is in describing his fictional characters. Pasternak uses historical events as the backdrop and the cause for the changes in the society and his characters. While the text is anti-Soviet, yes, Pasternak reflects on more than the horrors of the Civil War, communism, and revolution. This book, it is about staying human no matter the circumstances. It's about hope, it's about faith. The novel is complex. I cannot say that I particularly enjoyed it, although I didn't hate it either. It requires a lot of involvement from the reader, not only to keep track of the 200 characters that he throws at you in the span of 60 pages, but to me it felt like a mosaic, like a puzzle, where bits and pieces of the narrative, they construct this bigger picture of Zhivago's life. While the narrative is linear, Pasternak also drops narrative threads to pick them up later. He abandons the main characters per chapter's own end. Unimportant characters, seemingly unimportant characters, return suddenly. Then his characters would go into monologues about the philosophy and the fate of man and all of that, to then just as randomly stop for the author to describe the moon for a couple of paragraphs. This was the magnum opus for Pasternak, the pinnacle of all of his writing, so it makes sense for all of these things to be there, but I feel like it could have maybe done with a little bit of editing. But most importantly, Dr. Zhivago is inseparable from the meta-narrative around it. It exists only within the context of what happened to the author because of it. As I was preparing for this video, I read an opinion that I agree with, that abroad, in the West specifically, the book is considered to be the greatest Russian novel of the 20th century, while here, in post-Soviet Russia, we treat it more as the symbol of the resistance of the artist to the totalitarian state. Fun fact about the novel, the CIA played a huge part in getting Dr. Zhivago published. Thanks to them, the novel came out in Russian in the Netherlands. This book has great propaganda value, not only in its intrinsic message and the thought-provoking nature, but also for the circumstances of its publication. We have the opportunity to make Soviet citizens wonder what is wrong with their government when a fine literary work by the man acknowledged to be the greatest living Russian writer is not even available in his own country and in his own language for his own people to read. I'll leave some links in the description for you to check out if you want to learn more. Number 13, Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, 4.09 with 825,000 user ratings. I would have expected Anna Karenina to be higher on this list, but what can one woman do against all these angsty boys of Dostoevsky? Anna Karenina is a story of a woman, Anna, who in the early 19th century gets into an affair with a younger man, Vronsky, and the novel tells how it affects her life, his life, her husband, and her children's lives. In opposition to Anna, we have a character of Levin who, after some trials and tribulations, gets the picture-perfect wife and household. Tolstoy here, somewhat accurately I guess, describes the morals and the customs of the society, their attitudes towards marriage, infidelity, and specifically female infidelity, what's socially and morally acceptable, and some of the problems raised in the novel are still relevant to this day, unfortunately. He also touches on the bureaucracy and some of the changes that happened in society with Zemshines, for example. That's slightly less relevant. And Tolstoy also wouldn't be Tolstoy if he didn't push his preferred worldview onto the reader. Anna's failings as a wife, as a mother, and as a human being, I guess, are juxtaposed by Levin, an authorial self-insert who seeks to do the right thing and in the end finds the right path. The thing I feel like I should warn you about is that what the general public knows of the novel is about a third of it. Levin plays a huge part in this book, and his involvement is normally underplayed in the adaptations. And as an authorial self-insert, he goes on long tangents and long monologues about the fate of men, the fate of Russia, and religion. Fun fact about the novel, Anna's thoughts on the railway station at the very end there is one of the first examples of the stream of consciousness used in literature. Number 12, Heart of the Dog by Mikhail Bulgakov, 4.1 with 57,000 user ratings. Heart of the Dog is the story written by Mikhail Bulgakov, 1925. In it, a Professor Preobrazhensky transplants a human pituitary gland to a stray dog. The dog then transforms into a fully functioning human. He calls himself Sharikov, he develops a character, finds himself a job and a woman, but the conflict between him and the professor grows over Sharikov's rights as a new human. At first glance, if you only have the context that I've just given you, it looks like straight-up science fiction, but it wouldn't be a classic of Russian literature if it didn't have a added meaning. Bulgakov was part of the intelligentsia, so he was deeply disappointed by the revolution and what happened after. So the book is criticism and satire on the newly established communism, where the dog turned human stands for all of these people who'd gotten power with the establishment of the Soviet Union, and who, in professors' and authors' eye, didn't necessarily deserve it. Reading it now, 100 years later, and with communism well behind us, it might not be as straightforward as Bulgakov might have hoped. It is possible now to see both sides of the argument, because the professor is incredibly elitist and entitled, which I don't enjoy, and Sharikov is brash and brazen and also entitled. So while the author's sympathies are obvious, they might not match with yours as the reader. I think at the very least the book provides good food for thought on the human existence and human rights, so you can check it out. Fun fact about the novel, some daring researchers say that Shadikov is actually a parody of Lenin. I wouldn't go that far. Number 11, Eugene Onegin by Alexander Pushkin, 4.1 with 63,000 user ratings. I'm actually quite happy that Eugene Onegin made the cut, because Alexander Pushkin is the greatest author in the Russian-speaking world, but is somewhat completely unknown on the international scene. Eugene Onegin is a novel in verse. It tells a rather simple story of a man, Eugene Onegin, and his relationship with his friend Lensky, and a love story with a woman called Tatiana. The novel was criticized by Pushkin's contemporaries for the simplicity of the plot and characters, and while there is some truth to it, the novel is so much more. Because it is a novel in verse, the novel part of it can often take the back seat. The lyrical in the text allows the author-narrator multitudes of digressions about the nature, society, mankind, and even women's legs. Pushkin was a freak. The novel is a perfect example of the romanticism in the Russian literature, and it also provides a glance at the society of the time. There is an opinion that this novel in particular warrants full books of commentary that exist, because Pushkin apparently threw in quite a few details that would be completely understandable to his contemporaries, but require some explanation for us. And there is also a lot to be discussed about the style and general literary significance of the novel. For example, Onegin is one of the perfect examples of the superfluous man in the Russian literature, and the novel in general influenced many texts in Russian literature after it. It is notoriously difficult to find a good translation for Eugene Onegin. Poetry is difficult to translate at the best of times, and with Pushkin it's almost impossible. There are 50 translations of Eugene Onegin. I'm hoping to find a really good one that I can recommend to you once I actually get to making an episode on Eugene Onegin. Fun fact about the novel, Pushkin actually invented a new poetic meter for this novel, now called Onegin verse, a iambic tetrameter with an unusual rhyme scheme. A, B, C, C, D, D, E, F, F, E, G, G, where the uppercase letters stand for feminine rhymes, while the lowercase letters stand for the masculine rhymes. Number 10, Hero of Our Time by Mikhail Lermontov, 4.11 with 57,000 user ratings. A nice place is actually taken by the Hero of Our Time, even if fewer people have actually read it. The book consists of 5 different stories told out of chronological order about a man called Pechorin, and each story tells a different adventure of his in the Caucasus. Pechorin is an interesting character. Lermontov himself called him a portrait composed of all of our sins of our generation taken to the maximum. He's cold and aloof, manipulative and narcissistic, and yet attractive and somehow irresistible. We see this character type quite a bit in the popular media today, starting with somebody like Edward Cullen even, and it's an interesting character type to obsess over, trying to understand them and their actions. Because on the surface, Pechorin is an asshole. His actions are manipulative, he has very little regard for others, and everything that he does to chase away his boredom. And as I read it, I exclaimed quite a few times at his manipulations and gaslighting, but that's what makes him interesting. Because a good character does not necessarily need to be good, he just needs to be well written and consistent, and Pechorin is that. The stories are also told out of chronological order, and that adds to the intrigue as to who Pechorin actually is. The novel is a good example of early psychological prose. We get to see Pechorin viewed by others, but also his own introspective as to his motives and urges. Fun fact, Lermontov used his own experiences in exile in the Caucasus to inform the novel, that led to unwanted comparisons of him to his protagonist. And in A Cruel Twist of Fate, Lermontov himself died in a duel under circumstances that are somewhat similar to the ones that he describes for Pechorin in the Princess Mary chapter. Number 9, The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Leo Tolstoy, 4.12 with 153,000 user ratings. I'm gonna be honest with you, I don't think I've heard about this story before I started this video, and it's a great oversight on my part. Tolstoy describes the life of an ordinary judge, Ivan Ilyich, and specifically the process of his illness and the period right before his death, and it's brilliant. While I personally have yet to experience this type of fear of death, I recognize what Tolstoy writes to be true. The relationship that the protagonist has with his illness and the inescapable death, the various stages of emotions that he goes through, but also his attitudes towards outside world and his family, for example. It's all very raw, sometimes uncomfortable, but yet so true. A curiosity is that the novel is called The Death of Ivan Ilyich while it describes his life, but was he ever really alive? He is just as selfish, just as power hungry as everybody around him, so the society around him is also dead. True Tolstoy fashion, the only person alive is the peasant man Gerasim. Honestly, if you want to check something out by Tolstoy and you don't want to go into the monoliths that he's famous for, you can start with this one. Fun fact about the novel, various researchers have tried to diagnose Ivan Ilyich as to what actually caused his death and what illness he was suffering from, and the consensus seems to be that it was cancer. Number 8, Roadside Picnic by Arkadiy and Boris Strugatsky, 4.15 with 64,000 user ratings. A curveball is actually Roadside Picnic by Boris and Arkadiy Strugatsky. You don't normally get to see them on top whatever, and it's an oversight. Strugatsky are the prime example of the science fiction of the 20th century leaning a little bit towards dystopian fiction. In the universe of the Roadside Picnic, there was an extraterrestrial activity in 6 places on Earth that are now guarded, as inexplicable things still happen there. The protagonist, Frederick Schuchert, over the course of a few years goes into one of these zones, both legally and illegally, and we follow him on these adventures and we see how it transforms and affects him. I am personally not a big reader of science fiction, so their books are, strictly speaking, not my cup of tea, but I can see the talent there, so I can genuinely recommend that you check any of their books for yourself if you are interested in science fiction. Fun fact about the book, Strugatsky introduced the word stalker into the Russian language, but their definition was somebody who sneaks into restricted territories and smuggles stuff out of there. The prime example were those blokes who used to sneak into the Chernobyl territory. And so if you're talking to a Russian person and they're using stalker wrong, that's why. Number 7, War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, 4.16 with 300,000 user ratings. The monolith of Russian lit. This gargantuan novel tells the real events that happened in Russia during the Napoleonic Wars and his march on Moscow, and also tells the story of a few fictional families through whom we get to see the society and Russia of that time. And that's about all I can give you, otherwise we would be here all day. Look at this chart, for example. This is obviously an epic historic novel. Tolstoy describes real historical events. He spent quite a bit of time researching the Napoleonic Wars. He spent time in archives. Then there is this peace element of the novel, the fictional families that he describes, how they change, how those characters evolve, and how the society of the time functions. And interwoven are the philosophical ponderings of Tolstoy as to the meaning of love, family, patriotism, Russia in general, and the fate of man. The common theme is characters looking for meaning, for their true purpose. Look no further than Pierre Bezukov and Natasha Rostov. While Tolstoy does not necessarily deal in black and white, you might notice some preference that he has in his characters, but also themes and values. For instance, he holds money, power, and notoriety as false values, and criticizes any who seek it. Honestly, the book is so massive and so full of themes that I'm only scratching the surface here. Although, to be honest, I've read this book in high school and I have not reread it, but I don't remember hating it. It might seem like a chore just to look at it, but Tolstoy's writing is not, I don't want to call it easy, but it's not difficult to read him. So if you feel like it's an impossible task to get through it, fear not, it's really easy to read. Fun fact, 1886, War and Peace came out in Japan. It was a thin book called Crying Flowers and Mourning Willows, Last Ashes of the Bloody Wars in Northern Europe. The translator simply threw out everything unnecessary and only left the love story in. Number 6. Notes from Underworld, White Nights, The Dream of a Ridiculous Man, selections from The House of the Dead by Fyodor Dostoevsky. 4.18 with 76,000 user ratings. Goodreads lists all of these stories as one book, and I'm not gonna resist, let's get them out of the way. All these stories are somewhat different. White Nights looks like a romanticism story done by Dostoevsky. His superfluous man is dreamy and alone, and only comes with contact with reality briefly with Nastya, and then goes back into his loneliness. The Dream of a Ridiculous Man is Dostoevsky's pondering on the role of one man and his virtues in an evil world. One of the last books written by Dostoevsky, actually, and this theme also creeps up in the Brothers Karamazovs, although expressed a little bit differently. Notes from the Underworld is closest to Dostoevsky's greatest novels. It's full of his ideologies of Christianity and abnegation, told in the form of a confession of a civil servant, first as he ponders the true reasons of people's actions, progress, and civilization, and then as he tells a real story of a dinner and his visit to a brothel. The House of the Dead is as close as Dostoevsky got to an autobiographical story. It is set in a Siberian prison camp, and it tells a story of a nobleman, Garenchikov, who murdered his wife and confessed to that murder, and was sentenced to 10 years in a hard labor camp. He describes his time there, the attitudes of other prisoners to him, and other prisoners' stories. This reflects Dostoevsky's own experience in Omsk prison camp, although he was sentenced for political reasons and not murder. So the stories of the prisoners in the House of the Dead, they are the stories of Dostoevsky fellow convicts, if altered and embellished, obviously. So out of these, White Nights is probably the lightest one of them. All of the others, they have a strong philosophical flavor to them. Notes from the Underworld was even compared to Nietzsche. Fun fact, the protagonists of 3 of these stories don't have names. One might argue that it adds universality to them. Number 5, The Idiot by Fyodor Dostoevsky, 4.2 with 175,000 user ratings. The Idiot is also a book I have not read. I've made it through maybe a third of it, but then all of these ideas of Dostoevsky that I hate came to the surface, so I gave up. The Idiot tells the story of a Prince Pushkin, a kind, simple, humble man who returns to Russia from Switzerland after spending years in an institution for his mental illness. In Moscow, he encounters people of various qualities, including a man Rogozhin, his polar opposite, and a woman Nastasya Filipovna, with whom he falls in love, and these 3 form a love triangle. Through this connection to a strange prince, the characters start showing different sides of themselves, but it's not enough to change their true natures. The novel was an attempt by Dostoevsky to portray a good character, a prophet of this time, somebody completely pure, and how a character like that would behave when he encounters the corrupt and the vicious of this world. Whether he succeeded or not, I will leave it for you to decide. From the third that I've read, I felt very little for Pushkin. He annoyed me just as much as the flawed characters around him, so it's clearly not a book for me. Fun fact, Pushkin is actually Jesus. Did you know that? Dostoevsky actually called him Jesus Christ in his drafts until he gave him a proper name. Jesus. Number 4, Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky, 4.26 with 864,000 user ratings. The most rated book with over 864,000 user ratings, probably the most famous Dostoevsky novel in the Russian-speaking world. That's the one that we are forced to read in high school, and coincidentally, the only one I've read. The premise you should be familiar with: a broke student, Rodion Raskolnikov, kills an old woman, and the book is dedicated to his ponderings as to why he did what he did, whether he had the right to do it, and his inner turmoil of guilt and conscience. Dostoevsky flips the detective genre as the crime happens early on, and we know from the start as to who done it. The tension is created by the impending punishment. As a study of a slightly distorted mind, and it can be fascinating if you're into that sort of thing. Dostoevsky characters are normally the bottom of the barrel, awful. Look at Raskolnikov. He does not feel traditional guilt over the terrible deed that he'd done. He is angry that he feels guilty because he believes that there are exceptional people out there who have the right to kill others and not feel guilty. And if he, Raskolnikov, feels guilty, then he's not exceptional. It's an interesting thought experiment, but it's so out there that I cannot find my footing in this novel. If you enjoyed the novel, all the power to you. You're definitely not alone, but I didn't like it. And even as I listened to lectures from people who love it and they've studied it, and I'm over here like, I understand their thought process. I even get what Dostoevsky was trying to say, but it so firmly does not resonate with me that truly engaging with the text is almost impossible for me. All Dostoevsky books are philosophical in one way or another, and since we seem to disagree on some of the fundamental beliefs, it makes my enjoyment of the books almost impossible, really. Fun fact about the novel, Dostoevsky first thought of writing the book in the first person as a confession from Raskolnikov, and he was supposed to end the book in suicide. Number 3, The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov, 4.29 with 338,000 user ratings. It warms my heart that at least one book of the top 5 is not Dostoevsky, and it's actually a really good book. It used to be my favorite out of all of Russian lit, and it's still very much enjoyable and I still love it. A mysterious stranger with his entourage arrives in the 1920s Moscow, and truly demonic things start to happen. People disappear, vampires wander the streets, the witches fly into the night. We then learn that the mysterious stranger came here looking for a specific master and his lover Margarita. In this text, Bulgakov waves different ideas and plots into one narrative. It has the depictions of the 1920s Moscow and its customs. It has ponderings on the meaning of art and writing. Then there is the conflict between the good versus evil and the religious motive. In the depictions of the supernatural, Bulgakov follows the examples set by Gogol and Hoffmann, and there is obviously a connection to Goethe's Faust. And generally, the book allows for multitudes of interpretations, especially since it's only been published like 40 years ago. So the researchers are still fighting over their interpretations. Truly, the book is prime for rereading. Every single time you will find a particular detail or a meaning that you have not seen before. I wholeheartedly recommend that you check it out if you haven't yet. Fun fact about the novel, on Patriarchy Pons, where the first chapter of the book happens and where the two unlucky fellows first meet the mysterious stranger, there is a sign now that says "Don't talk to strangers," a reference to the novel. Number 2, Demons by Fyodor Dostoevsky, 4.3 with 50,000 user ratings. And again, I have no personal opinions on this book, as I have not read it. In the novel, two men come back to a provincial town, the demonically beautiful Nicholas Stavrogin and the regular Joe Petrusha Verkhovensky. Upon their return, weird things start to happen. Scandals, fires, murders, political intrigue. Almost every character has a dark secret revealed. Within a month, most citizens either flee or go crazy or die. The novel is written as a chronicle. The narrator tries to describe the events as they occur, but as he gets personally involved, he loses objectivity, he jumps back and forth, which makes the novel somewhat difficult to follow, and it requires the total reader engagement, basically. Also, there is a chapter missing in between chapters 8 and 9 that was not allowed through by the censor's office. Most editions now publish it as an addendum. Dostoevsky first imagined it as an anti-nihilist story, but it quickly became a dark, thrilling tragedy of the world that lost its meaning. Dostoevsky was quite concerned about all of these ideas that were brewing in Russia at the time, like the liberalism, socialism, or even почвенничество, all radical political ideas. Dostoevsky himself called it a rather tendentious book, so the reading of it might depend on the reader's political stance. Fun fact, the story was originally inspired by real-life events, the murder of a student Ivanov, who was killed by his fellow students and friends, all members of a revolutionary organization, People's Massacre, led by a student Nechayev. Dostoevsky was quite concerned about this revolutionary movement that was brewing in the young people, but I need to tell you, this murder, it was premeditated. Nechayev was planning on killing this boy, and he was planning on strangling him with his own scarf, but Ivanov resisted. Nechayev then hit him on the head and then shot him. Nechayev brought 2 friends along with him who didn't even know what he was planning on doing. So they took the corpse and they put it into the coat of one of those guys, weighed it down with some rocks and threw it into a frozen river. The body was discovered not 2 days later thanks to the bloody trail that they've left as they dragged the body to the river, and the papers that they left in the coat led the police straight back to them. So I think Russia was safe. Number 1, The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky, 4.36 with 320,000 user ratings. And in the first place, we have The Brothers Karamazov, again, a book I have not read. It is a religious text posing as a detective story about patricide. The 3 brothers, Dmitry, Alexei, and Ivan Karamazov, argue about eternal questions such as the meaning of life, the immortality of the soul, and free will, while also solving money and women problems. And so that you don't jump at my throat here, here's a quote from Fyodor himself. "If I succeed, I'll do a good deed indeed. I'll make them confess that being a pure, ideal Christian is not abstract, but vividly real and possible, and that Christianity is the only haven that Russia has against all its evil." The book is believed to be the greatest work by Dostoevsky. It accumulated all of his ideas, beliefs, and experiences. Dostoevsky in general infused his characters with some of his own beliefs and backstories, and here all of the brothers carry at least part of Dostoevsky's own experiences and backstory, and the father Karamazov also bears heavy resemblance to Dostoevsky's own father Mikhail. The only thing that I should probably recommend to you based on limited research that I did is that you probably shouldn't jump straight into The Brothers Karamazov. Try something else by Dostoevsky first. Not only would it allow you to see if Dostoevsky's writing at all appealing to you, but also this particular book is incredibly heavy. I don't just mean by weight. Russian literature in general is not known for its cheerfulness, and it's in great part thanks to this dude. So reading anything by him, and especially Brothers, can be a rather difficult and taxing experience. Fun fact, the premise of the patricide comes from the Dostoevsky fellow convict Dmitry Ilyich, and was sentenced to 20 years of the hard prison camp. Ilyich denied his guilt, but all of the evidence pointed to him. Dostoevsky didn't believe in this crime for reasons, and in The House of the Dead he also said that Ilyich innocence was later proven in court officially, but Dostoevsky couldn't stop thinking about the fate of this man and how one mistake ruined his life. Do I agree with this list? Not really, and not only because Dostoevsky occupies most of it and I think is slightly overrated, but we're also missing quite a few notable pieces, like Chekhov comes to mind, for example. And also in general, since Dostoevsky so firmly occupies the top chart here, I need to say, I've seen this thought multiple times as I was researching for this video, that Dostoevsky is so famous because he managed to show the Russian soul in all its complexity. I reject that notion. Dostoevsky characters are not real people, at least in my experience. I've never met anyone like them, nor do I want to. I fully reject this Christian moral that he pushes of suffering and humility that looks like subservience. This is what led us to the situation we're in now. So if you're reading Dostoevsky and you think that you're learning about Russians, I need to tell you that it's not true. At least not for all of us. And obviously, let me know what you think of this list and what your personal number 1 of Russian literature is.